Hello. This PowerPoint gives us an overall introduction to special education. Chapter 1, Children with Exceptionalities and Their Families. So children with exceptionalities are areas of differences between children. And these areas could be mental characteristics, sensory abilities, communication abilities, behavior and emotional development, and physical characteristics. To be educationally exceptional, the differences must occur to an extent that the child requires either a modification of school practices or special education services to develop his or her unique capabilities, at least at an average standard level. If we look at a brief historical overview, in early history, those with special needs were viewed with superstition and often considered to be possessed by evil entities. And this was between 1500 BC and 1700 AD. In the 19th century, instead of viewing individuals as being possessed by something evil, people with special needs were often institutionalized and with people with mental health issues. And this was the method of service between 1790 and 1870. In the early 20th century, instead of institutions as an area of service, public school classes became a method of service between 1900 and 1950, but this was not mandatorily required. It was something where the public schools could choose to do this with some support from foundations and even some government grants. Between the 1950s and 1960s, this was an era where legislation and national support was provided, and so this request for special funding to provide services in a public school venue received more funding during this time. In the 1970s, this was called the era of normalization, where child advocacy and litigations resulted in actual legislation to require public schools to provide services for children with special needs. In the 1990s was an era of redirection, redefinition, and refinement, and the revisions of the legislative laws in regards to special education and public schools. So how many children with exceptionalities are there? Exceptionalities exist on a spectrum. Even children not officially identified as exceptional may have special needs. 6+ million children can be classified in one of the categories of exceptional children. This means that 1 in 10 children in the United States can be classified as exceptional. Also, there is a requirement of school failure to receive educational identification and referral for special services. So if we look at the percentage of high incidence disabilities for children or students ages 6 to 21, and something to keep in mind is this data comes from 2013, which means it was probably gathered in 2011. So the highest incidence, of course, is learning disabilities. And then we have speech and language, other health impairments, and lower rates for children with autism, intellectual and developmental disabilities, and behavioral and emotional disorders. Keeping in mind that these are the types of special needs that have higher numbers of children diagnosed as needing service. This chart gives us a percentage of low incidence disabilities for students ages 6 to 21. And these categories, as you can see, the highest percentage of these low incidence disabilities is multiple disabilities, hearing problems, orthopedic issues, visual, and then traumatic brain injury. And again, we have to consider the date of this data collection. Another issue we need to consider is the perspective of the interaction of the heredity of a child and the environment the child lives in, and our perspective on that. Before and up to 1960, heredity was considered to determine intelligence. In the 1960s, the perspective changed to environment determining intelligence. In the 1990s, we conceded that that's a combination, an interaction between heredity and environment. And in 2003, the Human Genome Project completed a map of human heredity, so we can actually determine where genetically these issues relating to exceptionalities might be found. So when we look at differences in development, there are two types. There are inter-individual differences, and this is the general gap in ability or performance between the child with exceptionalities and their peers. So this is between individuals, whereas intra-individual differences is a major variation in the abilities or development of a single child or within one child. So inter is between peers or all children. Intra is within a single child. So early identification is something that we've determined is essential. So the earlier the intervention in the developmental sequence of the child, the better. Increasingly, preschools, child care centers, and health providers are able to offer support and services for young children with exceptionalities and referrals early. Intervention should begin as soon as an exceptionality is identified, as early as at birth, so that children can be sent in a positive direction, receiving services that are needed for them to develop their skills and compensate for their special needs. Also, we need to keep in mind developmentally appropriate education principles for all children. Education must incorporate all developmental processes, not just cognitive. They must include physical, cognitive, and social emotional, and focus on the whole child. Also, knowledge of developmental research and theory is vital in an effective educational system, which means that we want to approach the child in an age-appropriate way so that we know what's reasonable to expect for a typical child at a particular age. The varying rates of individual development ranges of that must be also incorporated, and this would encompass the individually appropriate aspect of developmentally appropriate practices. And lastly, the influence of first language and family culture must be intertwined in the educational process. And this is appropriate for culture and first language. So the aspects of developmentally appropriate education include looking at the whole child, what is age appropriate, what is appropriate for the individual child, and what's appropriate for that child in relationship to their culture and first language. Today, services are provided for children with a response to intervention approach, and it's abbreviated uppercase R, lowercase t, uppercase I, or RTI. It's a 3-tier system of support for children with exceptionalities or special needs that allows for collaboration between general education and special education. And there are 3 tiers again. Universal tier number 1 changes within the general education classroom or inclusion. And that means that children with special needs are placed with their peers. Targeted tier 2 is interventions are provided within small groups of students in a resource room format. And then the 3rd tier is the intensive tier 3, where individualized educational services are included within alternative environments, such as self-contained classrooms. So 3 tiers: the universal tier, the targeted tier, and the intensive tier. So as we go through this textbook, we're going to be looking at exceptionalities and children with special needs, utilizing the information processing approach to development. And this analyzes how children manipulate information, how they monitor it, and create strategies for handling it as they gain experience. And the information processing approach was actually introduced by Sigler. So a computer metaphor can illustrate for us how the information processing approach can be applied to development. And so we're going to take a look at how this processing approach to development compares to a computer. A computer's information processing is limited by its hardware and software, just as an individual is limited by their heredity and their environment. The hardware limitations include the amount of data the computer can process, its capacity, and speed. The software limits the kind of data that can be used as input and the ways that data can be manipulated. So first, let's look at attention. And attention is the focusing of mental resources. And a computer plays attention when we push the on button or the power button that you can see there on the right. Attention is allocated in different ways. There's selective attention, which focuses on a specific relevant aspect of experience while ignoring those that are irrelevant. Divided attention, where concentrating on more than one activity at the same time. Sustained attention, or vigilance, this is the state of readiness to detect and respond to small changes occurring at random times in the environment. And finally, executive attention, which involves action planning, allocating attention to goals, error detection and compensation, monitoring progress on tasks, and dealing with novel or difficult circumstances. So 4 different ways that attention can be focused: selective, divided, sustained, and executive. Memory is the retention of information over time. The basic processes required for memory are encoding information, storing information, and then retrieving information. There are three types of memory. There's sensory memory, and this is information gained from the five senses. And this information is only maintained for 5 to 10 seconds. Something has to happen to process this information in order for you to retain it. Short-term memory has a limited capacity for retaining information, and this is up to 15 to 30 seconds. Long-term memory is a relatively permanent and unlimited type of memory. So let's give you an example. Let's say you're shopping in a grocery store, and usually in a grocery store there's some sort of music playing in the background. And usually we hear that music is playing and our senses are processing that, but we might not be paying attention to it. But if you hear a song played in a different way than you're expecting, you might pay attention to that, and if you do, that will stay in your memory for 5 to 10 seconds. But if you spend some time thinking about how that music is different than you expect, it's going to spend more time in your memory, and it'll be in your short-term memory for about 15 to 30 seconds. But if you decide that you want to remember that information so you can share it with a friend, then you're going to try and figure out how you can remember that and what makes that music different than what you've heard before. And so in the process of doing that, maybe singing along with it, maybe figuring out where it fits with other information or other songs you've heard before, you're more likely to commit that to your long-term memory and then be able to share that with a friend in the future. So thinking involves retrieving, manipulating, and transforming information. So with executive functioning, this involves utilizing and organizing your thoughts to learn, problem solve, and achieve goals. So throughout your textbook, you're going to see this information processing model. And you'll notice on the bottom right, there's a key where it indicates in red what would be the primary influence in a particular type of exceptionality, and then what would be associated with that primary influence. And you can see with this information processing model that it's all encompassed and functions within an emotional context. And then the executive function is the cognitive process of choosing. And so you have three categories there: attention, thinking, response, or information input, processing it, or information output. Under attention and information input, you can see this starts with some sort of stimulus. And so it would be affected by vision, hearing, kinesthetic or body issues or motor issues, haptic, and that has to do with touch, gustatory, which has to do with taste, and olfactory, which has to do with smell. And then thinking and processing would include memory. And remember, we talked about three types of memory: sensory, short-term, and long-term. Classification or organizing that information, association with other things you know, reasoning or processing, thinking about that information, and then evaluating that information. And response to the attention and thinking, or the information output, would be determined. One way you could do it is through spoken communication, written communication, some sort of physical or motor response like dancing, running, or social interactions. So this is the format that you're going to see within each chapter, focusing on specific exceptionalities or special needs. So the ecological model approach understands that children with exceptionalities, they function within a complex interaction with many environmental forces. And this is another way of looking at exceptionalities. This replaces a formerly used medical model, which just focused on the medical field and its interactions with children with exceptionalities. An ecological approach, on the other hand, seeks to modify the exceptional child's learning and behavior and the environment around the child. And so here's a depiction of the ecological theory of development that was proposed by Bronfenbrenner. And you can see that in the center of this model is the individual child and their characteristics. And then you'll see four systems that are circular, and then another system that kind of runs across all. The first system closest to the child is the microsystem, which includes family, school, peers, the neighborhood. And then there's a mesosystem that kind of is in between the microsystem and the exosystem, which kind of leads towards the macrosystem, which has to do with, and by the way, in the exosystem are friends of the family, legal services, social welfare system, mass media, government services, and the macro system has to do with attitudes and ideologies of the culture. And so those are the four main systems. And then we have a chronosystem, which is the patterning of environmental events and transitions over the life course, social historical conditions, and then time. And this chronosystem also has to do with generational aspects, like different generations and how that affects you. For example, the baby boomer generation has different influences in that chronosystem than Generation X individuals. So what are the roles of families when it comes to children with exceptionalities or special needs? Well, families are social systems directly related to the systems we just talked about: mothers, fathers, siblings. Anything impacting one family member will affect another. Families are embedded in larger sociocultural settings. Many important values and practices reflect a cultural history that needs to be understood for effective planning and parental interactions when providing services for children. And early intervention is particularly concerned with the strengthening of the family environment. And early intervention really understands that parents are the really long-term, lifetime advocates for their children. And so intervention really should be family-focused, especially in early intervention. So what are some considerations around the role of families? Well, in working with the families of a child with exceptionalities, it's really important to consider the family responses to the child with an exceptionality and the issues that families deal with in order to recognize their child is having a special need or exceptionality, grieving that their child may be different, accepting that, and moving on to accept services. Family and professional relationships have to be developed in order for families to trust. Emotional development and the family, And then siblings of the children with exceptionalities are affected by this whole event, and then assessing families themselves and their interactions. Also, culturally and linguistically diverse families need to also be considered. Family cultural values impact interactions with the child with exceptionalities as well as professionals providing services. Different cultures have different perspectives in regards to children themselves, but also children with special needs. Families come in many forms or family types. There are married families, there are cohabitating families, there are single parent families, there are foster parents, different cultures, and these cultures include attitudes, values, customs, and specific languages that family and friends transmit to children. And there could be tensions between the home culture and the school culture that can make the stresses of a child with exceptionalities or special needs much worse. A family's culture must be honored and valued as we provide services. So here is another bar graph in regards to representations of culturally and linguistically diverse children in special education. And you can see that it looks at 4 groups: white, black, Hispanic, and Asian. And this particular chart looks at 3 special needs or exceptionalities: intellectual and developmentally delayed, IDD, learning disabilities, and emotional disturbances. And you can see as we look at the 3 that far and large, the largest percentage of risk is for the Black or African American students. The next tends to be Hispanic, depending on the special need. For example, it's second, Hispanic is second under learning disabilities, equal with white for intellectual or developmental delayed. And then for white, the highest level there is learning disabilities. And then for Asian, you can see that for them, the highest percentage for them is also learning disabilities. So you can see this is the highest incident, as we saw in earlier bar charts. So when we consider diverse families, we have to keep in mind that poverty can complicate issues of diversity. The RTI system provides a way to meet the needs of children and families somewhere in the middle. Also, the Office of Special Education Programs can provide family support through regional centers. Although further research is needed on the effectiveness of these family support programs. Parent advocacy groups are another source of support and family empowerment. When they have an opportunity to communicate and share with other parents who have similar issues, that can often help support parents. Also, the transition to the community after school, after they complete their school progress in the preschool through 12th grade system, peer influence increases with age. Students take on a larger role in their own interventions and services as they grow older. Legislation today requires a transition plan to be developed when a student reaches age 16. Many community resources for persons with exceptionalities exist, but may be hidden within the community.